Welcome to the art and science of mead, mead testing and analysis, bench trials, and tasting trials. Welcome to our series of educational presentations dedicated to the craft of making mead. Welcome to bench trials and tasting trials. This is information that I didn't have when I first started out making mead. When I first started out, I found some recipes and I made them exactly according to the measurements and specifications that the recipe said. However many teaspoons of acid or tannin, and every time I made it, almost every time, it didn't turn out the way I expected. Yeah, some of them actually tasted pretty awful. I didn't realize back then that whenever you're making any additions to your mead, whether it's acid, tannin, back sweetening, you really need to do it based on what tastes best. It's really not that different from cooking. If you're making something and you taste it, it needs a little bit of salt, or maybe it needs garlic, or maybe something else. So with mead, when we're adding things to change the flavor, we need to decide that on what tastes best. That way you can really dial in the flavors to be the way you want. I almost never have a batch that's perfect immediately post-fermentation. I end up having to do something with it, whether it's to add something to change the flavor, or maybe to use a fining agent to help clarify it. So in this presentation, we're going to talk about how to do tasting trials, and we're also going to talk about bench trials, which are what we use to determine maybe what fining agent will work best to address any issues in our mead, or even to do bench trials to figure out if there are any issues at all that we need to worry about. I hope this presentation helps you to make the best mead possible. Bench trials and tasting trials. So what's the difference between bench trials and tasting trials? Bench trials are used to determine how to best fix or prevent a problem in your mead. Some of the examples might be trying to figure out what dose of a fining agent should be added to address a problem such as haziness. Other bench trials are to determine what the underlying cause of the issue is, or to determine if the mead will be stable over time, or if there's risk of it throwing some sediment or dust due to proteins. Tasting trials sometimes are also used to identify any problems or issues, which then might be followed up with a bench trial to try to figure out what treatment might actually work at fixing it. But tasting trials are also used to determine what you might want to add and how much in order to make your mead better from where it is currently. So you might use a tasting trial to detect oxidation or reductive faults, but you might also use it to determine how much acid or tannin you should add, or to determine should you back sweeten, and if you should, then by how much. The purpose of bench trials are to confirm the effectiveness of the fining agent, to make sure that the fining agent you've selected will actually work for the issue you have used it for. Back in the day, I would just use a fining agent and hope for the best, and that does work most of the time, but sometimes you'll have a problem batch where what you usually do doesn't seem to work, and that's when you need to think about doing a bench trial to try to figure out, what fining agent will work to fix whatever problem you're dealing with, and then also determine what the optimal dose is. Ideally, you want to use only just enough of a fining agent to accomplish your task, but no more. Certain fining agents, gelatin is a good example, can actually have risk of overfining, and so you only want to use just enough to accomplish whatever the task is that the fining agent is going to be used for, but no more than that. Also, to help you avoid adding too much accidentally, you can always add more later, but you can't take it out if you've added too much. Tasting trials help you identify issues with your mead, which can sometimes be addressed before they become severe. And again, like I mentioned, you might need to use a bench trial then to figure out what treatment you might use to deal with these issues. They're also useful to determine how much acid, tannins to add, or how much you should back sweeten. And then sometimes we might blend two different batches. Maybe one is a little bit too sweet and another one is too dry, and you decide to blend them. You might want to figure out, ratio, is it 50-50, 60-40, 80-20, 20-80, or whatnot? Well, how do you perform a bench trial? First, you need to identify what the issue is that you're trying to address. Is your mead still hazy? Are you worried about protein stability over time? Is there oxidation? Are there reductive flaws, such as sulfides? Then, once you identify what the problem is, then you need to decide what the best approach might be. Some examples, if you want protein stability, you'd use bentonite. If there's oxidation, you might use potassium caseinate or even PVPP, whereas you might use copper-based products for any type of reductive flaws or sulfide, Cupsit or Regulus are options. Then you need to review the manufacturer's recommended dose ranges. Most of these don't have one recommended dose, but a range from low dose to a higher dose. And then you determine what range of doses from the lowest to the highest that you will test in your bench trial to try to determine which one will be effective at the lowest dose possible. Why not just add a finding agent and hope for the best? To be honest, most of the time I don't perform bench trials when I'm having batches that don't have any problems. I have certain group of finding agents that I'm comfortable with and I use all of the time. And I use them at the usual dose and they work and there's no problem. So there's no reason to do a bench trial in that situation. But if you have an issue that you don't normally deal with, or there's a finding agent, with potential for overfining, or if I have to use a second or third finding agent that I normally need to use, first I want to do a bench trial to confirm that the agent that I'm thinking of using will work, and then also determine what dose I should use, ideally the lowest one possible. The equipment needed for performing a bench trial includes a graduated cylinder or volumetric flask. You need a very accurate scale. Being off by just a few tenths of a gram, in a small sample, that could, percentage-wise, that could, translate into a very large error when you do that into your main batch. Usually we measure our doses by a pipette, or you can use a syringe, with markings and add that way. When you prepare your solution, we typically don't use dry. We typically prepare a stock solution so that we are more accurate in our measurements, but you need to make sure that the stock solution is created in an accurate way as well, and then make sure that the solution is well mixed. Some finding agents may settle to the bottom, and so you need to shake them or stir them up before you measure out whatever volume you're going to be adding to each sample in your bench trial. So we often use 10% stock solution. So 10 grams of whatever it is that you're going to be using is mixed into 100 milliliters of distilled water. After you weigh out the finding agent, you mix it with about 80 milliliters, and then you shake or mix it until it's dissolved or all lumps are gone. You put it into a graduated cylinder, and then you fill up with more water to exactly the 100 milliliter mark. Many of these stock solutions can be stored in a refrigerator for up to 2 months. Make sure you do mix them or stir them if they've been sitting for a while, because there might be some sediment that's settled out. This chart here is from Scott Labs. It's very useful so that you can look up, how much, milliliters of your 10% stock solution will need to be added to your sample, depending on how big the sample volume is, 100 milliliters, 375, or even a full bottle of 750. You add them, and then you let them sit for the recommended contact time, remembering some finding agents may take 1 or 2 weeks before they're fully effective. In general, many of them are effective within the first few days, at least 70 or 80% effective, but you might need to let it sit covered so that fruit flies don't get in it and so that it doesn't evaporate, so that you can come back and look and see what it's done. Here's a photo from a bench trial that I had done. I had a problematic batch that just wouldn't clarify. And so 1, 2, and 3 are different doses of silica sol and chitosan. That's basically the same product or same ingredients in the product Super Clear. And then 5, 6, 7, 8 are different dosages of bentonite. And as you can see, number 7 and number 8 are the most clear. So definitely bentonite won this finding trial. And I decided to choose the dose at number 7, which was reasonably clear, and I was worried about overrefining if I chose the high dose of 8. Now sometimes, you can look at your test tubes and it's pretty obvious, which one won out and which one didn't. You just take a glance at it and it's pretty clear. But other times it can be hard to know for sure, and there can still be a little bit of haze that's present that you can't see with the naked eye, which results in you having some dust or sediment in your bottle later on. Now maybe as a home brewer you really don't care, it's not that important to you, but if you're entering competitions or you're a commercial mead maker and your bottles of mead may be sitting on the shelf for months, you might not want there to be any dust ending up in the bottle later on. So one way to help determine clarity beyond just the naked eye is to, in a darkened room, shine a bright pen light across the test tube, and one that has fully been clarified by your finding agent will only show a circle of light on the glass outside of the test tube, but there will not be a cylinder or cone of light in between them of haziness. This is a photo of a test tube from a finding trial that I had done. This was with super clear, and you can see, even though it looks pretty clear, when you shine the light up to it, there is a haziness in the beam of light as it goes through the test tube, and so that wasn't quite optimal. But here's the same finding trial where I used sparkleoid, and you can see it's very crystal clear. There is no haze at all between the light on each side of the test tube, and so that was the one that I chose in this situation to find. I chose the sparkleoid. Other bench trials we might do is to take a sample to assess for stability. Protein stability basically is assessed through two different methods. One is the hot water bath test. So for about an hour, the samples are heated. You want to make sure the lids are loose in the unintended event that the water starts boiling. You don't want those bottles to blow up. Just have the lids loosely so they don't splash around. And bring it up to about 80 degrees centigrade for an hour, and then allow them to cool and look at the haze and clarity afterwards. The heat basically denatures the proteins the same way as the white of an egg after it's cooked goes from clear to white. Same thing happens, and they sediment out. And you can just look for protein stability to confirm that you don't need to add any more finding agents, or you could even have different samples at different doses of a selected finding agent, and then look at which dose seems to be the most effective. Another method to assess protein stability is ethanol assay. It basically causes the proteins to become hazy and settle out fairly quickly. You might want to let it sit overnight, or a little bit longer, and then look to see. Another bench trial we use is for diagnosing the type of sulfides that we may have. Some are fairly easily, like hydrogen sulfide has very obvious odor, but some of the mercaptans and the dimethyl sulfides it's a little bit harder to determine. It's important because you want to make sure that if you are going to use a copper-based product that it's actually going to work, so you need to confirm that it truly is a sulfide flaw, and then you need to determine, do you need to pre-treat it with ascorbic acid prior to the copper-based product, or if you could just use the copper-based product only. Now this is a very high dose of copper sulfate that you're using, so you do not want to drink this. Definitely do not. Make sure you toss them out when you're done. You don't want to really swirl them either, because that's going to add some oxygen and change the results. So one is the control, of course. The other glass is the copper sulfate, and the other one is the ascorbic acid first, followed by copper sulfate. And you can look at this chart and decide: is it not a sulfide problem? Is it one of the disulfides? Is it hydrogen sulfide, mercaptan, and disulfide, or is it hydrogen sulfide and or mercaptan? And then you will know, if it does work, then maybe you can treat with one of the products such as Cupsit or Regulus, or you might want to do another bench trial at different dosages of those products, whichever one you choose, to decide what dose now do you need to use in order to fix that problem. In general, you need to make sure the conditions of the bench trial are very similar to what the conditions are in the main batch. Certain factors will affect how successful finding agents will work. Temperature is one of them, but another one that's not thought about as much is dissolved CO2. So if you take samples out and put them in little glasses, a lot of the dissolved sulfide, which you might not be able to see or taste, it may disappear. And so the finding agent in your bench trial might be more effective than when you add it to your main batch that may have a little bit more dissolved CO2 that you aren't aware of. And so that's something to keep in mind. You want to make sure the conditions are exactly the same so that the results are not going to be skewed or wrong. Some finding agents work more quickly than others. So if you're doing a bench trial, you might need to wait a week or two before you fully assess how effective they were, keeping them covered so they don't evaporate and fruit flies don't get in there. And once you determine what the best finding agent is and what the lowest effective dose is, then you can add it to your main batch. Obviously, calculate your dose and measure carefully. Record what you did and why. And that's because in the future, if you have a very similar situation, you'll remember what you do, and it might be easier to do your bench trial, or you might even get away without having to do a bench trial in the future, knowing what the problem is and how best to address it. Well, let's talk about tasting trials. I think tasting trials are one of the most fun parts of mead making. You can do it by yourself, but it's more fun and effective if you involve others. They help you determine how well your mead is developing and aging, and also help you detect any flaws before they become severe and unfixable. They also help you determine how much acid, sugar, or tannin you need to add post fermentation to try to make the mead even better than what it is currently. There's two types of tasting trials. Non-blinded, you know exactly what it is you're tasting. You pull it out of the barrel or the carboy and you're tasting it or smelling it. But it's still very useful, even though you know exactly what it is. Then you can decide, between different dosages of acid or tannin or back sweetening, how much to add. We sometimes do blinded tasting trials, and this is when there's the chance for bias. It's a type of tasting that's done by judges in competitions, but you can also do this, outside of competitions to help you practice to become a better judge, to learn where your sensory limits are, and also for detecting and comparing differences between different samples in a non-biased way. Now, there are general guidelines for how best to perform tasting trials. One is to try to do them earlier in the day before you're fatigued, and definitely before you have any palate fatigue from tasting or drinking anything else, and definitely before you have any intoxication, which can definitely skew your opinion of what you think might be best. You should try to avoid things that can interfere with your sense of smell or taste, such as eating or smoking, brushing your teeth. Do your tasting in a place where there's no distractions. So good lighting, but quiet. No perfume, cologne, any odors like that. You should try to avoid tasting too many samples at once, because of palate fatigue. Typically no more than 6 or 7 in a tasting session, but even that might be a bit high, especially if you're testing something that can fatigue your palate fairly quickly, such as when you're back sweetening. So maybe 4 or 5 might be better in that situation. Try to keep good records, otherwise you won't remember what you even decided. And try to involve others, because some folks might have different sensitivities or preferences, and that way, by involving multiple individuals, you can kind of account for that. There are times when I might be the only taster, when I'm trying to detect if there's a fault or some issue. And I'm honestly tasting and smelling all the time, even batches that are fermenting. I'll pull off pull the cork out of the bottle, and I'll smell it as it's fermenting to make sure there's no issues going on. But when you're doing a formal tasting trial, it is better to have a panel of tasters, because we all have our strengths and weaknesses. For example, I'm fairly blind to excessive sorbate. If somebody told me that there was too much sorbate in, I would say whatever you say, because I'm pretty blind to that. But I'm very sensitive to reductive faults, hypersensitive, I would say, more so than most. And so having someone else who has more of an average palate who says, I don't really notice anything, that might help me say, well, maybe this isn't as bad as I think it is. There's also the problem with what we call the cellar palate. You drink your own stuff so much that you get used to it and you think it's just fine, when maybe it isn't fine and it's got some problems. And that's why it's good to have other folks tasting it, to give you some honest feedback about, what's going on. And then finally, sometimes you can have different decisions based on, what level of a judge somebody is, or if you're in a business, a commercial meadery, maybe an employee might not want to offend the boss by telling them that the mead that they made, I don't know, sucks. It's not so good. So that's why it's good to have a panel to do it in a way that's going to be a little bit more objective. I cover acid additions a lot more in my acid and pH talk. On here, I'm going to focus mainly on determining the addition based on tasting. We often add acid to help balance the residual sugar. A sweet mead can be cloying, but when you add acid, it can help it become more crisp and seem less sweet. Even if you're not going to back sweeten, some meads that have a lower level acid, they seem just kind of flat. Kind of boring, not very exciting. And by adding acid, it can just brighten it up. And even like, for example, meads that have fruit in them, it can make them seem more fruity than they are otherwise. We use acids to help lower pH for stability over time. That's determined a little differently, but we still might want to do a tasting trial because we're trying to add acid to lower the pH for that reason. If we add too much and now it's overly sour, you're going to have to do something to compensate for that, which might mean back sweetening. Too much acid, of course, can make the mead seem tart, and if there's any tannins around, sometimes it can make them seem more dry and more astringent than they would be otherwise if you had not added too much acid. Over time, you might find that there's a certain level of acid that seems to work best in a mead with a certain level of sugar, so you kind of have a ballpark range of what you normally might add when you're replicating that batch. But even then, there's factors that can affect how the acid will taste in any given batch. What type of fruit you use. Some fruits have more tannins. Carbonation is a big one also. Carbonation will add carbonic acid, so that will lower the amount of acid you would need to add as compared to if it was a still mead of the exact same batch. But even just the carbonation, the bubbles themselves, they seem to lighten the viscosity, and make it seem lighter, a mead that is a sweet mead. So you might not need to use as much acid to balance that sugar in a carbonated mead for both of those reasons. And then, of course, if there's tannins present, some of them can be made to seem a little bit more harsh and astringent if you add too much acid. And so even though there's different ranges you might think about adding, it's best to determine how much to add in a tasting trial rather than by a set formula or predetermined dose. I've met winemakers over the years who, they try to add, a certain number of grams per liter, due to this formula they have or whatnot. But that you can fail if you do that. It's much better to do a tasting trial. It doesn't take that long, and you're going to be much happier with your results as compared to if you just added something and it didn't work out, and now you've basically ruined the whole batch, or at least made it. Now you have to do something else to try to balance that acid out. Although we measure the dry powdered acid when we're adding to our main batch, it can be very difficult, if not impossible, to measure extremely small amounts, with the scales that we have. And that's why we often will make a 10% stock solution. So first you have 10 grams of the acid measured out into a graduated cylinder. You put in 80 milliliters of water, and then you mix or stir vigorously until it's completely dissolved, and then you top it off with another 20 mil or so that it's exactly at the 100 milliliter mark. And you want it to be exactly at that mark because you want this to be truly a 10% stock solution, and not a 9.5 or an 11.5 solution, because that might interfere with what you end up determining in your tasting trial. And the beauty of this is if you use 100 milliliter samples in your tasting trial, if you add 1 milliliter of the 10% stock solution, that will increase your acid by 1 gram liter of titratable acidity. So it's very easy to do the math later on when you're calculating how to extrapolate what you decided in your tasting trial to what you're going to add to your main batch. Tannins are used for a lot of things. They have antioxidant purposes, and that's not what we're really talking about in this presentation. But they are also added to help balance residual sugar. They can somewhat subdue the hotness of a highly alcoholic mead, and they provide mouthfeel and structure. Depending on the source, though, if you add too much, it can add bitterness or astringency. So similar to acid additions, determining how much tannins to add really is best determined through a tasting trial. This is another chart from Scott Labs, basically recommending compared to a 10% stock solution with maybe fining agents or with acids, we recommend a 2.5% stock solution. And that's because typically we don't add as large of an amount of tannin into our meat as compared to acid based on, based on weight. And same way, except you're measuring out 2.5 grams of the dry tannin into the graduated cylinder, and then mixing it until there's no more lumps or clumps, and then topping it off to exactly 100 milliliters. And as you can see, depending on what your sample size is, there's different amounts, and some of these are actually very tiny, so you're going to have an accurate pipette in order to measure such small amounts that you may be adding. And then that brings us to back sweetening. So, it's important to determine, how much sugar or honey you're going to add to back sweeten. And when you're doing your tasting trials, you can use sugar or honey or diluted honey. If I'm going to consider doing multiple additions, I typically do the back sweetening first, because then once the sugar is there, then I can determine how much acid, if any, and how much tannin, if any, that I want to add later. Palate fatigue is real, and especially when you're doing back sweetening trials, just be aware of that. And maybe you might only want to do a small flight that, maybe just 4 or 5 that you're going to taste, and then take a break for a while or even until the next day. And once you've decided upon how much you're going to back sweeten, it's always good to recheck it the next day when you have a fresh palate to see if that's really is what you thought it was, and that it is going to work. There's potential sources of sugar for back sweetening. Table sugar is, readily available. It's fairly easily to dissolve, even in a cool temperature mead. But the downside is it doesn't give you the full, aroma and other flavor characteristics that you would get as if you were doing your tasting trial with honey. Now, honey, of course, gives you that, not just the sweetness, but also the flavor profile. But honey is sticky, and it doesn't dissolve very quickly into a cooler temperatured mead, so it can be kind of a problem to work with in your tasting trials. So often I will use a diluted honey solution because it does provide the flavor profile of the honey, but it's much more easier to dissolve into your samples, and also it's much more easy to measure, based on milliliter for how much I'm going to add to my samples. On the right is a calculator by FirmCalc, and I recommend FirmCalc, and this is free access. But it shows if you have a honey that you measured, at 83 Brix. I recommend having a honey refractometer so you know exactly what the Brix is of your honey, and then you can create, a dilute solution. I usually aim for around 60 Brix. It doesn't have to be exactly that. The main thing is exactly what the Brix is, so then you can use that to figure out how much to add to the main batch later on. This is taken from another very useful website called Wine Ads, and basically it's just that. It gives you calculators to determine, how much to add, and not just for back sweetening, but also for acid and for sulfite. It also gives you information on, how to do a tasting trial like this. And with table sugar, it's pretty easy. It's pretty much exactly a 1-to-1 amount if you're adding it directly into a 100 milliliter sample size. Of course, you don't get the honey flavor as you would with honey. Now, if you're using honey into a 100 milliliter sample, the amounts you're going to use are very small, and plus honey is very viscous and sticky, so it's going to be somewhat challenging to measure up these small amounts and then get them dissolved in each of these samples. So that's why I tend to use my diluted honey solution that I measured, or I created to be about 60%, 60 Brix. These measurements are also fairly small, but because this is much more dilute, it's easier to measure, using a pipette or using a syringe. Well, let's do an example tasting trial, and let's do one with a tartaric acid with a 10% stock solution of tartaric acid. We'll decide on your sample size, and the math is often easier with 100 ml. You don't have to use 100 milliliters. If you want to use 50, that's fine, but then keep in mind the amount that you'd have to add would be about half of what you'd add into 100 ml. That seems obvious, but when you're making these samples up, there is, you could have some kind of error, and then obviously that would be a problem. Decide how many samples you'd like to have in your tasting trial. We recommend no more than 6 or 7, but even that is a little bit high, so I often will only do about 4 or 5 samples max. Set up your glasses. Make sure they're all of the same size and shape. There can be slight differences in perception of what it is you're tasting based on the shape and size of the glass. So they should all be identical. Everything really should be identical, except the difference should be the addition that you had done. One sample should be kept out with it nothing added as a control, so you can compare to what you have to see, what these additions do. And then decide by how much you want to go up for each step. It really depends on what your level of perception is. For acid trials, I usually increase by about 0.5 grams per liter in each sample. For other, additions, I might use a different step up, depending. And then accurately measure out 100 milliliters into each glass. The control will basically be nothing added. Sample 1 will be 0.5 grams per liter. Then sample 2, 1 gram per liter. Sample 3, 1.5 grams per liter. And then sample 4, 2 grams per liter. And the way that you add that, if these are 100 milliliter samples using the 10% stock solution of tartaric acid, would be straightforward. You basically add the exact same amount of milliliters of that 10% solution to each glass and make sure that you mix them so that it's well dispersed. And then you try each of these. And let's say you can't decide between sample 2 and sample 3. You could make up another sample that's 1.25 grams per liter to see if you like that one better, as compared to one or the other of these. That brings us to discrimination tasting trials. So these are a little bit different than what we were doing, having the series of tastings in order to pick, and choose which one seems to be the best out of, whatever it is that you've added. A lot of us are familiar with descriptive tasting. That's basically what happens in a competition with judges, and we basically describe in words or using a checklist, the appearance, the aroma, the flavor and mouthfeel, the overall impression, as well as are there any faults or other issues. This is such an important type of mead evaluation and tasting that I'm actually not going to discuss it in this presentation. I think it's so important that I'm going to have a whole separate presentation purely about descriptive tasting, evaluation, and judging of mead, because I think it's so important it really needs to have its own separate presentation. The trials I'm talking about in this part of this presentation are discrimination trials. Basically, the tasters are trying to determine which samples are different, but they're not going to describe. They can. I mean, you can ask them to write some comments of what they thought, but that's not required in discrimination tasting. And the ones that are available include paired comparison, same different, duo trio, triangle tasting, and then paired preference. And myself, when I do these, I prefer either the triangle or the paired preference typically. These are not usually going to be done by home mead makers, unless you're doing some research of some kind. Even commercial meaderies may or may not want to do this, but they can be useful to try to detect if there is truly a difference, between what you're doing. But like I said, I'm not going to be talking about judging or descriptive tasting in this presentation. So the first type of discrimination testing is paired comparison. The tasters basically state which sample fulfills a certain condition. Typically it's an attribute like sweetness or sourness, intensity of flavor. The probability of guessing a correct response without knowing what the correct response is 50-50. The advantage is you don't need a lot of samples, and it's fairly straightforward. Most of us understand, which sample is more sweet, which sample is more sour, and so on and so forth. Of course, the disadvantage is, besides needing to know what the attribute is that's going to change, is it's not statistically powerful. There's a high chance of guessing the correct answer, so you must use a larger number of tasters. So the minimal number of tasters is 7, as it is for many of those that that have problems with not being quite as statistically powered. Now, you can get away with this by doing multiple tastings on different days. So maybe you only have 2 or 3 tasters. They just end up tasting multiple samples of the same thing. Down at the bottom of this chart, as with the other charts related to this, discrimination tasting, you'll see, how many correct responses are required out of total responses in order to be considered a statistically significant difference. Same different. So basically in this trial, there are two samples which are compared with each other, and the tasters basically say, are they the same or are they different? The chances of guessing a correct response without knowing the correct response is about 50%. Advantage is only a small number of samples, and you don't even need to know what the difference is. It's just, is there a difference? So you can use untrained or less experienced tasters in this type of trial. But it's not statistically powerful unless you use a large panel of tasters or you perform a large number of tastings. And so there's different ways of doing this, but typically you have two coded test samples, A and B, and you can serve them in different ways, A, B, A, B, A, B, B. And it's it's important to make sure that these are like served randomly so that no one knows exactly whether they're going to be different or the same. And the significance again is at the bottom. So if you did 12 tastings, then at least 10 of them have to be correct for it to be significant. Otherwise, if not, then there is no significant difference between these. It's the difference, whatever the difference is, it's not enough for it to be detected. The duo trio, there are 3 samples, one of which is identified as the control, and then there's other 2. One is the same as the control and one is the test product. And basically the tasters have to figure out which one is the same and then which one is not, from the control that you're comparing it to. There's still a 50-50 chance of guessing a correct response without knowing what the correct response is. It is quick to set up. It kind of makes sense. You don't even really need to know what the difference is, but you do require a large panel of tasters or a large number of tastings in order to be more statistically powerful. And so there's different ways of setting it up, but basically you're going to have the reference, and then you're going to have 2 test samples, A and B, and then they just have to, you serve them differently, and then they have to pick out which one is the, which one is the same as the reference and which one isn't. Triangle testing. So this is one that I use. I like it because the probability of a taster to answer a correct response is less than the others. The others are about 50%, but the chance of guessing the correct response in the triangle testing is only 30%. You don't need it because of that. You don't need quite as high number of panel tasters on your panel, and so thus it has greater power than some of the other methods that you might use for discrimination testing. There's still risk of error. For example, the position might cause someone, if they don't really know what the difference is, they may just pick the one in the middle. And if the tasters are talking to each other, which is a big no-no, that can also cause error in this, as well as any other type of discrimination tasting trial. But the minimum number of tasters is less. The others require 7 tasters to do this as one flight. Whereas this, to do it as one flight, you only require 5 tasters. And again, if you only have 2 or 3, you can get away with that if you just do multiple tastings with the same, with the number of tasters that you happen to have. And basically, there's 3 test samples. 2 are the same, but they have a different code, and then one is different. And basically, you have to pick out the one that's the odd one out. For there to be significance, if you do 5 tastings, then at least 4 out of 5 have to be correct. Otherwise, there's not a significant difference. And same if you do repeated testing, then you can look at the numbers down there, how many you need to have correct responses in order to have a statistically significant difference between these samples. And this slide here is to show how this really should be set up as a triangle. If you put the 3 samples in a line, and the taster doesn't know what the difference is, they are forced to pick the one out and to guess. But many people might pick the one in the middle. I don't really know. I'll just pick that one. Whereas if you put it in a triangle, that's hopefully going to help account for that at least just a little bit. So it really should be the samples should be set out in a triangle format. Then there's the pair preference, and this is pretty straightforward also, and I occasionally will use this as well. Basically, the tasters say which one do they prefer. Usually after you do the other tests and you dial in, whatever it is that you're doing to your Mead, then the tasters compare the 2 samples to decide which one do I like. And because of that, it's a lot. You can use just about anybody. I mean, you can use employees. You can use, even if you're a commercial meader, you could use your customers. If you're a home mead maker, just ask your family members, which one do you like best? It's a fairly simple question. I like it. I don't like this one as much. It isn't as statistically powerful as, say, the triangle, so that is one disadvantage. But because it's a fairly straightforward question, this is this is one that that can be set up and done pretty easy. The taster does have to make a choice. They can't say they prefer neither. They have to pick one or the other. And so on the bottom, you see the number of total correct responses out of the total responses for it to be statistically significant. Well, there are best practices for performing discrimination trials. For one, the tasters should taste the mead blind in order to minimize bias. At the minimum, there should be at least 2 independent tasters. Now, as I showed in some of those charts, they need to have a minimum of 7, but it could be 2 tasters doing multiple tastings of the same thing, in order to account for that. So it might be that you could just have 2 tasters doing a higher number of tastings. But the more tasters you have and the more tastings that are done, the better the statistical significance. The tasting should be repeated to confirm that what the tasters have decided is correct, and they're less likely to have guessed a correct answer. Try to minimize presentation effects to reduce variability from fatigue or bias. There should not be any talking during tasting. That's so that the tasters do not influence the judgment of each other. And this is true even when you're judging in a competition. One of the worst things is when they're talking about what they're tasting before everybody has made up their own mind. And this is where one more outspoken judge, or maybe experienced judge, with an inexperienced judge, may end up influencing, someone else, and you don't want that to happen, and you don't want that to happen in a discrimination trial either. And so there shouldn't be any talking until everything has been completed. Remember, there is palate fatigue, so the flights should not be very large, and you can only do, a few of them in a day, and if you need to do more, you might need to come back and do it the next day. And even before you do a discrimination trial, at first you need to establish that there is even a difference first before you decide on your preference. Because if you can't detect a difference between, whatever it is that you're doing the tasting trial for, then it's really a waste of time to do a preference trial. Because if you can't detect a difference, then you're not going to be able to determine what your preference is. Well, that brings us to the conclusion of bench and tasting trials. These are an important tool for mead makers. When I started out, I just would add my acid or tannin, based on a measurement of a recipe, and sometimes it didn't work out at all, and sometimes it actually, ruined the batch of mead. I didn't know that, you really need to taste it. It's sort of like when you're cooking, you add a little bit of salt, you taste whatever you're making. Oh, I need a little bit of salt. You put a little bit in, taste it again. Okay, that's better. Yeah, and then you won't, you don't mess it up by just adding a whole bunch based on a previously determined measurement. Bench trials help you determine whether the finding agent is effective and also what the lowest possible effective dose is. They help confirm that there are no issues that may show up later, confirm that there's protein stability, for example. Tasting trials can also help identify faults before they become problematic, and then once you identify that there is a fault of some kind present, you might use a bench trial to determine what is the optimal treatment to manage that. And tasting trials help you determine how much acid or tannin you should add, or how much you should back sweeten, if at all, before you end up adding it to the main batch. If you have a tasting trial, then how much you're going to need to add to your main batch, so you're less likely to make a mistake, and have something that you're going to have to deal with later, by blending into a different batch or something. So always keep in mind, you can always add more later, but you just can't take it out afterwards if you've added too much. So that's why it's so good to do a bench trial for finding agents and other treatments, and a tasting trial for any additions that you might do post-fermentation. And that brings us to the conclusion of the presentation, bench trials and tasting trials. Like I said, I will have a whole separate presentation regarding mead evaluation, descriptive tasting, and what you might be doing as if you were judging mead, or just wanting to evaluate it, in a comprehensive fashion. I appreciate you watching our videos, and I hope that you find them to be helpful. Thank you.